Welcome to the race to replace. Every week we will spill the tea on what is going on in the Liberal leadership race. The prize up for grabs here, the keys to Rideau Cottage. Maybe not the keys, at least a chance to Airbnb it for 2 weeks, plus or minus. Thanks for being here today. I guess we should tell you a bit about ourselves before we jump into the whole show that we're talking about here. My name is Dan Arnold. I did polling for the Trudeau Liberals in the last three federal elections. I worked as Director of Research and Advertising in the Prime Minister's office from 2015 to 2021. Got out, I think, at a decent time, like my friends here. And now I work at Polarity. I still do numbers and polling and all that type of stuff here. Vandana, for those who have not been glued to Power and Politics for the past 2 weeks and maybe don't already know everything about you, why don't you tell people something about yourself?
Sure. My name is Vandana Kattar. Thank you guys for joining. I have been in politics for almost 15 years, and I started off as a volunteer and a riding assistant in Navi Main's constituency office for the riding of Mississauga Brampton South in 2010 as my first paid work in politics, and then worked there ever since. And I worked at the Prime Minister's office up until 2 years ago, and now I work at TD Bank as head of comms for DEI and ESG.
And I'm Tyler Meredith. I've been a Liberal for 27 years. My first campaign was 1997, knocking doors in Ottawa Centre for Mac Harb when I was the age of 11. And like V and Dan, I worked in the Prime Minister's office from 2015 and then eventually in the Department of Finance until I left the Government of Canada in 2022 and bumped around working for Bill Morneau, Chrystia Freeland, and Justin Trudeau in economic policy.
Yeah, I think the whole point of this podcast here is we all are kind of like Captain Planet. We have our own special powers. I'm good at public opinion research. Vandana's great at organizing, knows what's going on the ground. Tyler has a very unnerving understanding of complex policy issues. And we'll be looking at what's going on in the Liberal leadership race through those different lenses. The other thing I guess we should say before we get going here, I know when you listen to these pundit shows, people always say, like, I got to disclose my conflicts. Let's just disclose that we all have conflicts in every single direction to every single campaign here. We have friends, family, colleagues, past and present, working for everybody here. Tyler plays pickleball with Frank Bayless every Friday. We know all these candidates, and we obviously have our biases that come from that, but none of us are involved with any of the leadership campaigns. And our whole point of doing this here is to just give you our honest take on what's going on and to make sense of this race in a fair way. We will call people out when they screw up, and look, a lot of them are going to screw up. I think we've already seen that. And we will give people credit when they do something well in the race.
And let's be honest, like, come on, guys, we know why that we are all brought together. It's because we wanted to make sure that this race wouldn't actually be taken over by Tom Mulcair and his prognostications about who's going to win.
Well, I think also like that's an important point, Tyler. But also, yes. I think having sat in the past out of leadership races and didn't understand how they work, I think you want to give an inside scoop of what the rules are, how they affect different candidates, but also like what really matters and things that you may think are really important. Leadership race may not be actually. So we're looking forward to pull back the curtains a bit and explain to people like what's really going to make sense here.
Yeah, I think leadership races, even the media, don't always have a great understanding of what's actually going on behind the scenes. Tyler did a bit of a drive-by on Tom Mulcair there, but I think what you meant to say is Tom Mulcair thought Jean Charest was going to win the PC or the Conservative leadership race a couple of years ago, and that's just a thing where people are kind of not basing on what's actually going on, and we're going to try to give a bit of perspective on what's actually going on the ground behind the scenes on the Liberal leadership race. So our first segment, every week, once we do our kind of banter about the weather or whatever we do to kick things off, we'll be talking about the headlines and what is in the news. And I think this week we want to talk about the rules, and we want to talk about who is actually running, and we'll probably spend more time on who's not running, I guess, given how the last week has gone. But maybe we'll kick it off on the rules. And I do think rules are always interesting in leadership races because, like, imagine you had a general election and the Prime Minister went to the Governor General and called for an election. And then the Governor General walked outside and said, okay, Canada, here's how we're going to vote this time. And this is how long the election is going to be. This is who's allowed to vote. This is going to be the process. And every time it was different. That's kind of leadership races. Every time the rules are a little bit different, and that has a pretty big impact on the race. So, Tyler, why don't you tell us what we know so far and what we don't know about the rules?
Yeah. So I think it's important for all of us to understand that there's the National Executive Board, which has obviously started the work in choosing the first set of rules, which is really when are we going to vote, who's going to vote, how are we going to vote, right? But now we've actually also launched a rules committee who's going to, in the next number of days, and we're recording this mid-late week. And so when this podcast is out, we may actually have the final rules, but they are starting to go through a process of actually enumerating more of the detailed elements. So let's just take you briefly through what we know so far. So the first and most important thing is we're going to vote and have a leader by March 9th, 2025. And that's important because I think as for anyone who's listened to the Hurley Burly, there's an excellent episode that goes into great detail about all the different permutations of what could have been done via the Constitution. The Constitution anticipated potentially a 90 to 100-day process, and the National Executive Board effectively had to override that process in order to get in under the wire to have somebody in place before March 24th, when Parliament is coming back, so that, of course, we actually do have a replacement to Justin Trudeau potentially going into an election. So as I say, the most important thing, we're going to be having a leader by March 9th. What we also know is that we're going to have a cutoff for eligible registered Liberals by January 27th. And that's important because there has also been some changes to who constitutes a registered Liberal relative to who's been able to vote in the past. And I think the important thing is that the party so far has clarified that that person must be, of course, age 14 or older. They must support the purposes of the party. And most importantly, they must be a Canadian citizen, have status under the Indian Act, or be a permanent resident of Canada. Now, for anyone who's been following this closely, there's obviously been questions around the Foreign Interference Committee, an inquiry as to whether or not having a more expansive definition, which could have included foreign students, would have allowed other people to involve themselves not ordinarily in the process. And then, of course, they can't be a member of any other political party, and they could not have declared an intention to be a candidate in the House of Commons other than as a candidate for the party. We've also seen additional information come out in the last 24 hours or so as it relates to the fundraising rules. In particular, there's going to be a $350,000 entry fee, and the party has actually recently indicated kind of the way in which that those sets of deposits have to be rolled out to the party. I think most importantly is it's not 350 all at once. It's obviously, given the short period of the race, it's going to put a premium on somebody who can raise that money. But the first most important fee for anybody who is thinking today about maybe wanting to run, they would have to deposit $50,000 by January 23rd. So that's effectively mid next week. That's a refundable contribution, but any subsequent deposit that they make is non-refundable. So basically, after the 23rd, after you deposited your $50,000, any subsequent decision to stay in the race and any virtue deposits that you make, you will not get back.
So if I want to run, and I'm still thinking about it, I'm considering, but if I want to run, I need to get $50,000 in about another week. And then it's going to be another 50,000, then another 125, then another 100, so on and so forth. So there's kind of like every week you have to pay a bit more to, if you want to stay in, or else you're out. And I guess this will be a way to sort of narrow the field down, is what we expect, right? Because some people probably make the first couple payments, but then can't really get those big ones at the end. That's what we're assuming.
That's right. Yeah, no, I think that's really the question, right? Is that there's been a lot of discussion as to whether or not having set a rate, an entry fee that's at that high, the $350,000 cumulatively. Some people have said, is this going to discourage other people from entering the race? I'm not so sure that it would necessarily, just because I think we've actually seen a lot of different candidates put their name out there. And I'm sure, and I'd be curious whether you guys agree with this, but like, I think that the decisions that people have made to enter or not enter hasn't been so much about fundraising. It's more, can they organize in the short period of time? Because we're talking about a race that's under 60 days, right? And that's obviously shorter than historically for the Liberal Party of Canada. The shortest race, I think, as we may all know, was the one that Patrick Brown was replaced by Doug Ford in 2018. That was about 45 days. And that previously set the record for what is the shortest race, right? And so it really is a question as to whether somebody can mount a national campaign and be competitive in all parts of the country in that period of time if they don't yet have an organization.
Well, I think also like fundraising is a key part of being the leader of the party. And you're going to need that. So if you're preparing to be that job, you're going to have to fundraise.
And most importantly, they have set a $5 million spending limit. So for all those candidates who are planning to raise $10 million in 2 months and spend $10 million, tough break there. Really, the national executive has really screwed you over on that one. Vandana, what does this mean? So Tyler's talked a bit about the money. He also said January 27th is the deadline to sign people up to vote.
Yeah.
What does that mean? What does the race look like because of that?
Well, that's right around the corner. I would say anyone who knows what they're doing should be in phase two. And I would say there's essentially four phases of any like leadership campaign. So phase one needs to be, and I'll give some examples from things I've worked on, but setting up your organization. So no one knows this is like everyone kind of saw this coming. So I think a lot of people should have been prepared. And what that means is meeting people across the country, meeting new donors and connecting with people so you can ready them for when the time comes. So setting the organization. So back when it came Justin Trudeau's leadership, we had obviously Katie Telford and Jerry Butts, but we also had Natalie Baines, Richard Maximus. I worked for them supporting organizational efforts. We put like Brett Ballman, who's helping organize like the campaign office that we had in Toronto, like Marlene Floyd helping out operations. So we just need those pieces in each campaign. And then phase two is actually when you mobilize people to sign up to be a member. So people don't realize your membership collapses. Some people, we have voted us in 2015, but not 2019, 2021. So you want to get some of those people back. And you want to hopefully attract new voters to the party. So maybe people who, I was very young when the prime minister became the prime minister, but now, I'm older, I have a house, I have kids, and now who's the next generation of young people who are going to be interested in this? And because Ingo was 14, how do you empower young people? And how do you build that coalition of voters? So on my first day of working for Justin Trudeau on the leadership campaign, me and Nav picked him up and we drove to Georgetown, we drove to Burlington, we drove to Hamilton. And each event we met with people and we were housed in their house for a little bit and they put together an event for us, whether it was at a local community center, sometimes at a hotel, sometimes at their home. And it was like 10, 15, 100 people and encourage them to like sign up to be a member so you can vote for this guy and introduce the prime minister and at the time, Justin Trudeau. And he was still very new. People knew he was from history, but that's how it started. So, there was already people on the ground and their jobs were to like connect with people, even when the prime minister wasn't there, and connect them to ask them to vote. So we would set people across the country, both Richard and Nav, and we would follow up with them and say, how many members did you sign up? And we would have a way of recording that. So data collection is so important because if you can't find out who's a member, you can't get them to get out the vote. And the third piece after the cutoff is persuasion. So I remember Bonnie Crombie's campaign for the Ontario Liberal leadership, it was about, okay, who else can join us? Like who may be number two? Maybe Bonnie's not number one for them. Could she be number two for you? And eventually we had Adel Jamdil join us in the campaign and his people chose Bonnie. So you want to persuade people why they're your option. And then finally, most important is GOTV. Now, I'll give an example. A lot of people will think of the media and they'll say, who's talking with the front runners? So I had a friend of mine who I spoke about and I said to him, he's like, well, Bonnie's going to win. And I'm like, are you sure? He's like, yeah, I love her. And I'm like, okay, are you going to sign up to be a Liberal member? And are you going to vote for her? He's like, oh, I don't do that. I'm not a member of any party. I'm like, that's the difference. You may vote for her in a general, but you still need that step to like have someone sign up and then go somewhere afterwards in their riding and actually put that vote forward. And that's a huge piece. That's also like, it might be a rainy day, it could be a cold day. And like, we have some cold parts of the country and it is March. It's not warm in a lot of places here. So you're gonna have to get people to get out the doors and actually make sure they're voting. And so that's the four pieces of the campaign. But each piece is important. So while a lot of people are paying attention to media pieces, you gotta pay attention to who's actually an organizer and can develop that organization across the country and persuade people to join the party and then persuade them to come out to vote.
And it seems to me like at this point, like you said, we're in phase two right now. So up until January
You're in
27th.
phase one, kind of like.
Yeah. Well, I guess people are squishing phases 1 and 2 together here. But up until January 27th, they can sign people up. We haven't seen much from the candidates publicly. I mean, Mark Carney spent 30 minutes on the Rideau Canal, I saw. Beyond that, we really haven't seen events or coffee parties, rallies, anything like that. My guess is the candidates are just basically glued to their phones. Is that what we're assuming is going on right now? Just calling through lists and calling through to sign people up? And is that what we assume is going on now?
I think a lot of call lists, but also I think it's about caucus relations too. I know a lot of caucus members have been called because caucus members already have an organization. They have funders, they have donors, they have volunteers, they have an organization. So I think a part of it is also a race of who has the best caucus relations. And I've heard a lot of feedback from different caucus members about who called who and what the conversation was like because you got a short time frame. So, okay, can I connect with Doug Dollywall? Can I connect with Jamie Maloney? And can I find out what can I convince them to be on my team, and therefore their organization can support me? So I think that's what they're doing. And I think hoping that digitally, because we are a different world. So 2014, 2013 is a different time from now. I think connecting people digitally as much as possible is going to be really important.
Excellent. Okay, so we're assuming we got the sign up phase, then we're kind of into persuasion after that. Yeah, I will say you mentioned pulling people to the polls to vote. We don't really actually even know how the voting process is going to
Yeah.
work yet. I think we're assuming in the next couple of days the national executive is going to make it known what the vote is. I think people assume it'll be online, but I mean it could be phone, it could be
Be
in
fun. You could
person.
also
Like,
could be also a series of days. So sometimes it'd
yeah,
be like, over a weekend, over a series of days, they'll have different areas. Like, I mean, it is a lot of heavy lifting to go across the country and have voting booths in every riding. So I'm not sure how they'll do that. And voting online, you're going to have to think of like, how do you identify people? So I think there's still a lot of tweaks that the party has to figure out, but there's a number of options in a short amount of time.
I guess we also don't know what the debate process will be, if there will be
Yeah.
debates, how many there will be. I personally, I would say I would like to see a lot of debates. I feel like these are people we need to battle test for the general election. They're going to have to debate Pierre Poilievre probably in a couple of weeks after this campaign is over, and I'd like to see them. Ideally, we could have like 4 or 5 debates, and if the party's listening,
I would hate that.
if you want to schedule them for Wednesday night right before we record our podcasts every week, that would be really convenient because then we can dissect them. But we'll see what they end up doing on that front there. There
And
might be
as
a
an
showcase,
organizer,
there might be an announcement. I guess we'll kind
yeah.
of see what that looks like.
Yeah, but as an organizer, I would hate a number of debates, because I think that the main debate scenes, I do agree we need debates because it'll be interesting for people to see their ideas, especially because you don't really know them. And I think it's really important for the persuasion side of voters, like that phase. But, as someone who has put time into briefing people or had to take time away from events because someone needs to be briefed before a debate, like, that's painful. Like, and I feel like that takes a lot of time away from like getting more members of the party. So, I mean, or getting more persuasion. So on the organizational side, that's a pain, but I totally hear that people, this is a short time, need to find out, what people are thinking.
Okay.
Well, and let's remember, this is the first time that we're going to be debating what is effectively the future of a Liberal Party and what the Liberal Party stands for since Justin Trudeau has been leader, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I, just because at the time I was working in a think tank at the time, I didn't participate actually in the leadership in 2013 that selected the prime minister. But I remember watching it, right? And that, correct me if I'm wrong, if I remember that lasted about 9-10 months or so. It was a
It was so
long
long.
process.
Yes.
But you got, I mean, even if you knew that
October
Justin
to
Trudeau was
June.
probably going to win, like, you got a good sense of getting out and having definition on issues about where the party was going to go, because we were coming back from third
Yeah.
place at that time, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is the challenge: is so much, let's be honest, so much of the party has been defined by the events and issues that have characterized the leadership of Justin Trudeau, and this is our chance now to define what issues and ideas, frankly, we're eventually going to identify ourselves around going into the next election to fight Pierre Poilievre, likely. And, it's an interesting time, right? Because there's this big discussion going on somewhat outside the party, but also somewhat inside the party. Like, do we pull the party to the center, quote unquote, however we define that? Or, do we define it more on the left in terms of how we will engage and try to bring some of those NDP voters over that have been part of our coalition in the past? And so I just think it will be really important for debates to suss out some of those differences, and also, frankly, to define the differences against Pierre Poilievre, right? Because I think Vandana, you're right. Like, I think a lot of people will be looking for who they think is the most electable, winnable candidate, right? And so I suspect we're going to see daily tracking polls starting soon. People are going to be watching those things very closely to see who does the best in the matchup with Pierre Poilievre. And really, I think to do that, it has to be paired with some assessment of what are the sets of issues and topics that they want to define themselves against him.
Yeah, and I think in order to get voters, like, you need to connect with them emotionally. So a lot of the work
Yeah.
I did in the Prime Minister's office, and also just throughout my time in politics, is connecting with young people and different segments of communities and voters. And Dan and I, like you and I, worked on that a lot. But across the country, like underserved communities, women, youth, and how do you build that coalition of voters for you? And I think some of that debate could, as you're debating ideas and where the party goes, it also can help emotionally connect to some voters as to why am I going to pick Mark Carney, or why would I pick Karine Gould? And I think that's that is an important part of persuasion. But I think that is also defining a bit more like, how are you using those issues to connect with people?
Okay.
Totally. And if I could just give an example to V's point from actually the Ontario Liberal leadership race, right? Like I think we can agree that at the start of the campaign, there was questions about whether Bonnie Crombie was, sufficiently progressive, or was she going to move too far to in a different direction that some progressives in the party didn't feel comfortable with. And I think what was interesting about debates, and Persuasion was that over the course of that campaign, I think she became, embraced and accepted by progressives as an adequate choice. And it was because of the length of that campaign, it was because of debates, it was because of Persuasion that happened in a way that I think if you had called the vote much earlier in the race, we might have had a different outcome.
Confession time. I'm a highly competitive guy. My high school basketball coach, Mr. Schweitzer, who told me to shoot more and jump less, would agree with that. So would most of Ottawa. I'm guessing you're not shocked. Healthy competition drives the good stuff in life, in politics, in business. We've been talking about competition here for weeks now. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, believes more Canadians benefit from more competition in the marketplace, not less. So much so they've gone to court to fight a federal cabinet order barring them from offering wholesale internet services to new customers in Ontario and Quebec. They're not the only ones who feel that way. No less an authority than the Competition Bureau of Canada said that allowing TELUS wholesale access in Ontario and Quebec will improve competitive conditions in those markets, and here's the key thing, lower prices for consumers. Let me just underline the salient points here. The Competition Bureau is an independent law enforcement agency. They protect and promote competition for the benefit of Canadian consumers and businesses. They're evidence-based and follow the facts. And they've reiterated their position on this matter 3 times now in writing, most recently just last week. That's not doubling down, it's tripling down. Putting it mildly, it's a curious thing when a federal cabinet order is so at odds with the consistent opinion of an independent federal law enforcement agency. If you feel similarly and want to make your voice heard in supporting policy that encourages competition, innovative service bundles, and more choice, please add your name to TELUS's petition at demandmoreinternetchoice.ca.
Let's talk about who's in the race, because I think that's what people are kind of curious about is, what are we hearing? I'm having trouble keeping up, to be honest. So I hope, Vandana, I think you've got a list here. It is rapidly evolving by the day. Perhaps by the time you listen to this, other candidates will have dropped out or joined the race. We'll see. There was a fun about a 2-hour period last Friday when it looked like Brian Gallant was going to run for Liberal leadership. I logged on to National News Watch. There's an article. Brian Gallant is preparing to Liberal leadership campaign. I go, this is really interesting. It's part of the grand tradition of leadership races to have a former New Brunswick premier be rumored to run in the grand tradition of Frank McKenna and Bernard Lord. So maybe not surprising, but I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. So I started Googling Brian Gallant and like getting more information about him, and he's bilingual.
A lot of
and
work in
he's,
those 2 hours.
look, this was important stuff. I knew we had a podcast episode coming up. I was thinking about maybe drafting Brian Gallant in our leadership draft, which is our next segment, just as a bit of a teaser there. But by the time I had done my research on Brian Gallant, there was another headline that said Brian Gallant drops out of Liberal leadership race. So it was a sad end to that 2-hour campaign there. What else do we know, Vandana? Who is running and who is still contemplating running?
Okay, so let's see. We have Mark Carney, who I believe is launching tomorrow. We have Chrystia Freeland, who even her Twitter today said she had like 3 phones with her making phone calls, and that there's an announcement from her soon.
5 cups of tea.
5 cups of tea. That's a lot of tea. Karina Gould, Chandra Arya, Frank Bayliss. I think those still considering are Jaime Batiste and Jonathan Wilkinson. And those who are rumors, I think as the Atlantic kind of figures out who is their person, I think I've heard rumors about Andrew Furey. I've also heard rumors about Ruby Dalla. So I'm not sure for those who remember her from back in the day, but
There's a blast from the past.
Blast from the past.
I look forward to the press conference where Ruby Dalla announces she is not running.
Dalla.
Yeah. And who's out? We know Christy Clark is out. We have Minister LeBlanc, Minister Bentley Joly, Minister Arnold, François-Philippe Champagne, who announced yesterday, and Minister McKinnon. So except for Christy Clark, a lot of people from the cabinet.
Okay, so I mean, we're going to do a segment after this where we kind of talk about the people that are still in the race and rumored to be in the race, and we'll kind of spend some time on them. But um, should we talk about the people who've dropped out here? Any names that stand out? How about you, Tyler? Anyone that you expected to run who's not in? Anyone who,
Let's talk
by
about
them
what's
not
been a
running, changes the race? What's your sense?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I was surprised that Christy Clark decided not to run. And I should say, for transparency, I went on a trip with her this summer as part of an educational tour in Israel, and I had never met her before in that context, and she has a very electric personality that I thought if you kind of put it on a national stage, that could be very interesting. Obviously, she ran into some obstacles with whether or not she spoke French, and let's all admit that I think her interview that she did with CBC could not probably have gone worse on the question of whether she had voted in the conservative leadership race or not. But I'm still was surprised that she didn't run, and she may have a future in the Liberal Party. And I think, some of the people who didn't run, obviously there's like the question of like, if you're in cabinet, are you staying around because you've got a big job, especially, right? Because we're facing tariffs potentially next week. But I also think some people are looking ahead and thinking, is this leader that we're selecting now going to be here for a long time? And is it better for me to run now versus later? And I think, in Christie's case, it'll be interesting to see if there is a liberal leadership race at some point in the future after this, does she come back? I think she might.
Yeah, I think it's she was like serious. Like she was not just putting out a trial balloon and getting a couple of headlines and not really considering this thing. I think the other candidates, I mean, Champagne, it doesn't seem like was ever really putting a team together, or like I think a few of the other ones maybe weren't as serious, but I mean, she was going full speed and hit the brakes, and whether or not that's because of the interview or because of the French. I do think the French was a problem for a lot of liberals. I saw 4 or 5 cabinet ministers last Friday tweeting about how the next leader needs to be bilingual. I don't think they were just trying to torpedo Chandra's campaign. I think they probably had other targets in mind with that as well too. So I think that was probably something that was holding her back. I think the interview she could have got past because ultimately, I mean, she can just say what she did say. Like I joined the Conservative Party to before it
Mhm.
was cool to stop Pierre Poilievre. I was trying to stop Pierre Poilievre. I mean, Jean Charest would probably do better in this liberal leadership race than he did in the conservative leadership race. So people, I think, would have sympathy for wanting to support Jean Charest. I do think the language barrier was a problem, and just lack of time again to sort of mount a strong enough campaign to win.
It's also really
Yeah,
hard to
and
start off on a back foot. You take that in the first week and everyone's talking about it. It's really hard to recover from that. I know they tried and she had the tweet, but it could be something that you might think, okay, maybe the stars aren't aligned this time.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm surprised, but I'm disappointed. I think that Dominic didn't go in the race. I supported Dominic LeBlanc for leader for about 10 days back in 2008 when he was running against Michael Ignatieff and Bob Ray, and then I think Ray and Dominic both dropped out, and Ignatieff was crowned our leader. So I'm a big fan of his, and I do think Dominic is somebody who, all the other candidates we've talked about, they certainly have a potential to do a lot of great things and to be great
Mm-hmm.
leaders. But Dominic is somebody who like, you know what you're getting. Like this is a guy you can rely on to throw into an election campaign. It's kind of like, okay, there's an election in 2 weeks. Let's just throw Dominic in the swimming pool and he'll swim and he'll figure it out, right? And he's got those political skills, and I think he could have been the favorite really if he was in this race. So I think that's a loss for sure on the race. I think we'll certainly hear the other candidates who dropped out. People like, this is not the end of Melanie Joly's political career. I think she's going to be back, obviously, in some capacity in the future. And probably the same for Anita Anand too, I'd expect.
I think for like Dom breaks my heart, and like in all transparency, I am very good friends with Dominic LeBlanc, and I remember even recently we were having dinner in the market, and we were walking. He was walking back to my car, and everyone here on the street were just like, "Oh my God, Dominic, Monsieur LeBlanc, Monsieur LeBlanc, Dominic, Dominic," and he was like, "Oh, this is the commissioner's like EA. This is this person." He just like has this connection with people, so I think it is it makes me sad, but I appreciate he put the country first. That's important. And I think
yeah.
Minister Lee did the same thing. But Minister Lee has a very strong organization. She like was often in, she would talk to me about going to Toronto, and she would meet with people and meet with different communities and whatnot. So I think that organization still exists, and I'm actually curious how she leverages it to see who's the leader. So I think she'll probably use those influences and see, in fact, the person she wants to back and bring a lot of people with her.
Can I just ask both of you, like, do you think that, and let's take the example there of Melanie Joly. Like, so if Melanie Joly gets in and endorses somebody at some point in the race, and by the way, I think it will be interesting and hard for Quebec ministers who want to endorse when there's not necessarily a very clear, other than Frank Baylis, Quebec candidate in the race, right? Because the person's going to have to speak French and meet certain tests. But nonetheless, if they tell their people, we want you to go and support somebody, or I am endorsing somebody, like, how effectively do you bring those people with you? Because I do think, to your point, Vandana, earlier in like the Ontario Liberal leadership race, we saw examples of where that worked and also where it didn't.
Yeah, I think it depends on how strongly connection, like how strong a connection you have with those people. And I would say, I give an example of like Nav Baines. Like, there are people who still will listen to him and be like, "Who are you supporting?" And he's been out of the game for a long time. So it comes back to, like, these aren't relationships that have to be developed in a short time. It's about having one coffee, having two coffees, having a dinner, and actually connecting, having calls. And I think what happens, like, politicians who are really effective has those relationships, and Dominic Blanc has that ability, Melanie Joly has that ability, and they stay connected to people. So they're generally like their people, I would say. And I think if you've built an organization that is genuine and authentic, and then people then look to you as well, like, and they may not go exactly where you want to go, but your voice will really matter in how you persuade. And there's some people who I would be like, well, I don't know this person, but if you like them, okay, like, your values are my values. So I'm going to assume that you like this person, I should like this person too. So I think it does matter, but only if those relationships are authentic and genuine. I do feel Minister Joly has those.
Yeah, I think in the absence of a major Quebec candidate, with all due respect to Tyler's pickleball friend, Frank Baylis,
For the record, I don't play pickleball at all.
but with all due respect to Frank, I mean, there's not a major Quebec candidate in this race. So I think in that vacuum, if somebody like Melanie Joly, who is, the best known liberal in Quebec and has a very strong organization there, has been, co-chair of the national campaign, but also provincial campaigns. And, if she says she's endorsing someone and takes a significant role in their leadership campaign, like, that makes a difference. I think there's enough votes that are up for grabs in Quebec that she could move a large number of organizers, other MPs, even just regular liberal supporters with her towards another candidate, and would probably give that candidate a lot of credibility in the eyes of Quebecers too. So I think people like that, are going to play a big role if they choose to. She may choose not to endorse anybody and just focus on her portfolio. But if she does, that's a big deal, I think.
Can I just ask? Go ahead, Madeline.
No, go ahead, Pete.
I was going to say, I think also it helps her influence what a leader says and what their plan is for Quebec. So she says, I have this big organization, I can get behind you, but listen, for Quebecers, we need to hear X, Y, Z. So I think that'll be interesting how she uses her voice to advocate and to lobby people for what she thinks should be the vision for Quebec.
Do we think, just on Quebec, and I'm sure we're going to probably devote part of an episode coming up at some point on what's going on in Quebec as that plays out, because it's so significant to the party.
And that episode will be entirely in French. So I hope you've been practicing with Christy, Tyler.
I'm
fluently bilingual. I'm a
good.
product of French immersion.
Talk about Quebec.
Product of French immersion. So yes, right. I could do it. So we've also got a Quebec Liberal Party leadership race going on at the same time, right? And Pablo is quite involved in that race as one of the candidates, and is technically sitting as an independent right now in the House, although voting with the government, although House is not sitting, but whatever. Do we think that his people, his organization, is going to draw folks away that would otherwise be available? Like, is that going to cause difficulties with organizing in Quebec during this race?
I don't know. I think it depends on how strong. I think the Quebec Liberal Party and the Federal Liberal Party are different, similar to BC Liberals once, and Federal parties are different. I don't think his people get distracted to come here. I didn't get that sense from them. And I think, like, provincial politics, people who are really interested in provincial politics, like, that's their baby. Like, especially when it comes to Quebec, I found the same way with BC. Ontario has an issue because Ottawa's right there, and you're always competing with the two of them. But I find in a lot of the provinces, the provincial government actually matters more. So I don't think there'll be that much of a change, because Quebecers are going to really want to try to, bring about and bring a resurgence to the Liberal Party of Quebec. And I also find that a lot of provincial Liberal parties are trying to separate themselves federally, because they do feel the weight of the federal brand right now. So I actually don't think that'll be a problem in this case.
Okay. All right. Anything else people want to say on our dearly departed candidates here? Should we
Also
talk about the
said
people?
McKinnon. We didn't talk about
Oh,
McKinnon.
McKinney,
And I
yeah,
think he's a
yeah.
lovely person. I think he's strong. I think his biggest issue is that everyone knows him in Ottawa. He was a House leader. He was the national director of the party, I believe. I think he was the whip at some point. But he had such senior roles in Ottawa, but they're so Ottawa based. And he just became the minister fairly recently in Labour. I think we had enough time to go across the country and build his brand a bit. I think he would have been excellent. I think he's a great person to connect, but I just think it was too short a time for him, and I think he made the right decision. But maybe next time.
And just on that note, like I think it's interesting. Obviously, he wasn't going to consider entering the race because of family issues. But had we had this race a year ago or earlier, it's possible that Seamus O'Regan also would have potentially been in the race, right? Like he was certainly building, a bit of an organization and was very active. Along with Melanie in supporting Satchit for the presidency of the party. I think we can also say, like, I think the party would have also benefited from having him in the race too. And it's just a product, I think, of the time that we're in and the short window that we have, that some people have chosen that they can't run.
Yeah, and we've talked about the Quebec vacuum. There's also, other than Amy Baptiste, there's no real major Atlantic candidate with Dominic out and, as we said, Brian Gallant aborting his 2-week campaign or 2-hour campaign.
2 hour.
So that's another vacuum there, right? Where, if you have a big prominent Atlantic minister or someone like that, who wants to get involved and can move some people with them, that could be decisive. And every riding is worth the same, right? So you've got 4 ridings in PEI, not a lot of people there, but that's still 4 ridings, right? So that could be decisive. Okay, let's move on to our next segment, the Liberal leadership draft. I will concede off the top. I came up with this idea last week to do this draft. It made a lot more sense when we had 12 candidates in the race. Right now we are drafting probably the 3 of us, 3 serious candidates and a few others, but I still want to do it because I think this is a way to kind of set up our expectations for the race in terms of who's in the pole position and who's in second and third and so on. But also gives us a chance to talk about these candidates one at a time. So the way this will work, think of this as sort of like if we were drafting teams we think will win the Stanley Cup, and we would go in order, and the first person would pick the Vegas, and someone would pick Edmonton, and then a delusional person would pick the Leafs and ultimately lose.
Hey,
but ultimately,
hey, Dan, these are fighting words.
I'm a Sens fan, for the record.
Yeah, well, you could pick them too. That's the Frank Bayless of this race if we were doing this here. Anyways, we all pick our teams basically, and whoever picks the winning team that wins the cup wins the pool. So it's the same principle here. So we'll take turns picking Liberal candidates. The first person will pick the person they think is most likely to win. Then the next person will pick the person most likely to win of those still on the board. And we'll try to squeeze out 2 rounds out of this so that we can actually talk about some of these other candidates here, and maybe what they bring to the race. And then, whoever picks the person who wins the race ends up the grand champion of the race to replace political draft. And we'll do the snake draft. So we'll go 1, 2, 3, then 3, 2, 1 in the second round. So with those rules on the table, I have a little trivia question game to decide what order we will pick in for the race to replace draft. I'm going to read off 3 names of people who ran in the last Liberal leadership race. And you 2 will each pick one of those people. I'll get the third one, and whoever has the person who got the most votes in the last Liberal leadership race will pick first in our draft. Whoever picks the person from the last race who got the second most votes will pick second, and whoever picks the person who got the least votes will pick third. So I'm going to read the names, and either of you.
This is a very pollster kind of segment.
This is look. You told me come up with something, and this is a pollster thing. So our 3 people are Deborah Coyne, Karen McCrimmon, and George Tkach. Either one of you can jump in and claim one of them. Who you think did the best in the last Liberal leadership race? For those who have good memories.
Karen McCrimmon.
George McCash, I guess.
Who are you taking?
George.
You're taking George Crimmon? Okay, so in the last Liberal leadership race, for those who remember, Deborah Coyne got 0.7% of the vote. Karen McCrimmon got 0.68% of the vote. And George Tkach sadly dropped out before the final vote and endorsed Justin Trudeau, which means I've got the first pick in the draft, I believe, here. Tyler will pick second, and Vandana, you will pick third in the draft. So with that, I guess
I haven't heard Deborah Coyne's name in years. Sorry.
It took me a minute.
Yeah, and look, I mean, we're talking about like, and look, we're making fun of like, Frank Bayless and others, but like these are people who have been members of parliament, right? These are actually like,
Mhm.
in some respects, serious candidates who actually have a competent CV on their hands. In the last Liberal leadership race, there were people who had never run for office who were like, throwing their name out there to raise their profile. So, there's degrees of seriousness in the race. Okay, so I got the first pick then. So I don't think I'm going to overthink this here, and I will take from Fort Smith, Northwest Territories, Mark Carney. Seems like the obvious front runner from the chatter that we are hearing. Um, Carney is somebody I think benefits from this being a shorter race,
Mhm.
because in a shorter race, people who are better known, people who have organization, have a big advantage. And he has both of those things. He is maybe not quite as well known as Chrystia Freeland, but I think in all the polling that we've seen, he is, certainly in a tier with her in terms of the candidates who are best known with the general public. He has, he's been thinking about this for a while. I don't think it's a newsflash to anybody. So he's got a team around him. I think by virtue of that, that gives him a pretty good start on the race there. And look, I think liberals will probably look at him as somebody who is maybe a riskier bet because he's not, he's never run for office. He's never been an MP. So, I mean, that is a risk. But I think when you're 25 points behind in the polls, people are more inclined to take a risk. I think if we were,
Mhm.
if the liberals were leading in the polls right now, I think someone like a Chrystia Freeland might be the obvious choice then to kind of like continue the momentum where it's at. But I think
Leading in the
liberals,
polls, Justin Trudeau still be prime minister. I
well,
mean, well, he's the prime minister, but
fair
he's
point, fair
continuing on.
point, fair
Like,
point. But yeah, I think liberals want a change probably, are looking for someone who
yeah.
is an outsider. I know this will generate 50,000 Twitter comments from conservatives who say he's not an outsider. He met the Queen, but like he's changed. He's different certainly than what we've had in the party the last little bit, and I think that's got some appeal. Um, do people agree? Do we think Carney's the favorite? Are people in agreement on that?
I think this is where, like, I agree. I think there's gonna be a lot of like caucus behind him. Actually, I think people just naturally be inclined to him because of his CV. That he seems like he's like an adult in the room, someone can take on Trump. I'm curious. This is where again I agree. A shorter time span is better for him because I'm curious how he is in a crowd. I want to see him not behind a podium but shaking hands. I want to see him, commenting on something that he didn't engage in. So it's easy to drive a narrative that you're driving, but when you as prime minister, you had to deal with a lot of issues that you're not driving the message on that. You have to respond to something. So I'm curious how he'll engage on that. And again, going back to like, can he organize? So I find that sometimes you see a lot of strategists around, but you need the doers. You need the workhorses to actually go and sign up people. So I'm curious if I'll actually be able to bring out an organization. So, but I agree with you. I do think he's going to be seen as a front runner. But when everything hits the ground, I'm curious how it actually all play out.
So, Dan, I would have answered your question perhaps differently, and maybe this will get to my pick in a second. But if we had called this race or started this race and having this discussion last week, before some of the most recent polling came out, especially before Mark Carney's recent interview on The Daily Show, I think the polling, and you're the pollster, but tell me if I'm wrong. I think some of the polling, certainly the polling that Bruce Anderson's talked about online, would have suggested that there was a slight edge potentially. Obviously, it's very hard to sample who is a Liberal member and who's going to vote, but would seem to have a slight edge for Chrystia Freeland, although we obviously don't know how people will vote in a ranked ballot, right? and and now it would seem, at least according to the Leger poll that we saw this week, he has moved ahead of her, although it's not obvious that was a Daily Show effect because I think they sampled it before the show. But definitely, like, on momentum, I would say right now people are feeling very positive about him just because I think he really surpassed expectations with that interview. Some might say because expectations were low, at least on the sense of like, does he have a personality that like is not a central banker or doesn't present like a central banker. And I think, look, he did very well, right? And he presented very well. And you see online a lot of chatter that's kind of excited a little bit. I don't want to make the Kamala comparison because that didn't end well, but like there's a bit of momentum reaction, positive reaction. Now, will
Funny.
people feel the same way, right? In 2 weeks? I don't know.
Well, I think the Daily Show thing was fantastic for him. Like that could be the defining
Yeah.
moment of this leadership race when all is said and done. And you're right, the bar was set low. Like he just had to go on the Daily Show and not look like Michael Ignatieff on the Daily Show, which he did. But I think even above and beyond that, like he seemed relaxed. He
Mm-hmm.
seemed somewhat charming, almost genuinely funny, not just politician funny, but like
Yeah.
genuinely funny.
Yeah.
So I think he did a great job and helped himself out a
Yeah.
lot, given the knock on him as this guy is wooden and stiff and not a good communicator. If I was going to make one critique, though, of his Daily Show appearance, and I haven't heard this anywhere else, but Jon Stewart obviously wasn't lobbing hard questions at him. One of his questions was, Pierre Poilievre is a JK or
J.K. Rowling name.
J.K.
Yeah.
Rowling villain. He's the Draco Malfoy, anyways. But like, what do you think of Pierre Poilievre? Which is basically the setup to just spike the volleyball in any direction you want to. And Carney's answer was, during COVID, Pierre Poilievre decided he'd take the opportunity to talk about reducing spending and reducing taxes. I'm not even sure what the COVID tie-in is to that, if this is about CERB, but I think any critique of a liberal leader about Pierre Poilievre should
Yep.
not be that Pierre
Yeah.
Poilievre is going to cut taxes. That seems to
Yeah.
not be
Yeah.
his vulnerability right now. And I think, look, there's smart people around Carney. I'm sure they'll clean it up. I'm sure when he launches, he's going to have a much more compelling and concise critique of Poilievre. But that's something that I think maybe was a bit weaker. And like, it's just weird to me that he did better, I think, in that interview on style than on substance, which is not what you'd expect from Carney.
So I actually had the opposite reaction to that section of the interview. And the reason I say that is because I remember that specific clip that I know he's referring to of the press conference that Poilievre gave in early March 2020. I remember that because I was at the Department of Finance as we were getting ready to go into a pandemic. And it's a clip that's been seared into my memory for a long time. And I suspect, I'm pretty sure I can say that it was somebody around Carney who really, I think, encouraged him to make that comparison, because I think what they're trying to do is to try to get to a narrative that reminds people about how Canada weathered the 2008-09 financial crisis, right? And that he can insert himself into that kind of main character, as a main character into that story, in a way that I think if you were to talk about Brexit, let's be honest, like Canadians don't really care what happened in the UK 6 years ago. It's a relevant topic for my students at Monk, but like it's not a really thing that I think connects a lot of people. So I actually thought that segment was not bad. I also think that clip that he's referring to, if you put it into an interesting ad against Pierre Poilievre, but
I think the clip is
cutting
specifically
taxes.
The clip is specifically Poilievre saying we're conservatives, we don't help people, right? I think.
Yeah.
I've tested this many times at focus groups. You're right. It's a good clip. Like it shows Poilievre is heartless. It shows that he doesn't, he's not trying to help Canadians. He didn't have their backs when they needed the help. I just think like the cutting taxes thing is not like the line I would have used.
I think the one thing I would say, in similar to what Tyler said, what I liked about that is that he talked about the importance of social programs and social security and that net. And I think a lot of Canadians do depend on that. And I think some people have this idea that he can come in and he's also going to be the center right guy or whatever people want to call him. But I think he wanted to show that he truly believes in equity in the system, and sometimes it is in giving social support. So I think that was more also like, I agree with you, like don't highlight other people are cutting taxes and we are not. But, I like the highlight for him of these programs are important for Canadians. I think that was something that he wanted to define himself with.
Okay. Tyler, you've got the second pick.
All right. Well, you've gone with Carney. I will nominate my former boss, Chrystia Freeland. Obviously, for the record, I'm team neutral. But, look, I think Chrystia is, I think, Dan, as you said, somebody who is the most known, probably the most known candidate in the race. And probably you would have said, if we were having this discussion last fall or last summer, would have had probably the greatest difficulty in untethering herself from the Prime Minister, because, as the Prime Minister has reminded us, has been part of the government for a long time and critical to a lot of what the government has done. But obviously with the letter of how she resigned, right, I thought, at least at the time, and maybe people have forgotten because we're kind of in that vortex now of things moving so quickly, that letter did at least a job of kind of creating a story about how she wanted to say she was different, in a way that, again, when Kamala Harris went through that whole experience, she failed to define a narrative of what she disagreed with and where she would have done things differently, right? But of course, that comes into contact with reality, where I think some members, and certainly some caucus members, are perhaps have some residual anger about how that whole thing blew up, right? And that obviously has caused a lot of controversy. I think what's interesting, right, is how Chrystia Freeland may define herself in this race, because because both she and Carney, this is going to come as news to a lot of people because I don't think they present this way in ways that people assume. Both of them are Westerners, right? The two potential leading candidates in this race are Albertans or adjacent Albertans, right? I think you're going to hear from Chrystia Freeland that she will talk a lot about her roots from Alberta, because I think it will be a way for her into a conversation on things like climate change or energy or economic growth, where she wants to define herself differently from the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say, I think both in a Liberal leadership race where there's a point system that benefits, ridings in Alberta and things like that, but also even in a general election, like being the daughter of a farmer from Peace River, I think is more compelling than, being the Rosedale former international, whatever, right?
Rides a
So I
bike.
think, yeah, I think there's certainly a benefit in that. Yeah, I think two things that Chrystia has going for her would be one, Tyler, you mentioned the polling earlier. Any hypothetical poll this race is going to show either Carney or Freeland as the ones most likely to beat Poilievre. And that's not because they are necessarily the ones most likely to beat Poilievre. It's because they have the highest name recognition. So they're going to get picked by people on polls when they run these hypotheticals. But that will be perceived as being electable, and voters will, in the Liberal Party, are going to respond to that. And then I think, secondly, I mean, this leadership race is happening under the backdrop of Donald Trump coming to the presidency, putting tariffs on Canada. Like, this is what is happening in our world right now. This is probably going to be the ballot question of the next election. I think this is the ballot question the Liberal Party wants in the next election campaign is Trump. It's not housing, affordability, cost of living. And like, I've tested Christia's name in focus groups and surveys over the years. And like, she is known for what she did with the Trump negotiations the first time around. People found her tough. They felt she handled that well. As a party, we were running ads with her voice talking about Trump and
Tooth and nail.
everything. Yeah, like in the 2019 campaign. Like, so I mean, she's got a brand already on this issue, and I think she's announcing next week, and she's going to talk about tariffs, and like she's going to try to make this the issue, and say like, look, if the next election's about this, you can trust me on this. So I think she's got that going for her from a timing perspective.
So I think, like, to your point, I find outside, so to average people, that's a very attractive thing about her. I think, you can make the argument that she was complicit in whatever the PM did, et cetera. But, as Tyler said, she has this letter, and, you're the cabinet minister. Sometimes you're just going to do as, then you go with the team. But I would say, like, and I think a lot of women ask me about her, like, what's she like? Oh my God, she's so great. I do hear amongst party loyalists and caucus that they are still very angry at what she happened. As much as many of them were trying to get the PM to leave, or felt that they felt that what she did torpedoed her own party during a difficult time. And I think in a short race, we depend on caucus and those organizations. If you don't have those relationships naturally and people are angry at what you kind of put them through, I don't think that works for her. So I think it goes back to, I think on media, on a branding side, she has a really strong name, but actually driving an organization to help get those votes for her, like, I don't know she'll be able to do that, because right now, a lot of the support you'll need is from caucus members and those key party loyalists who are organizers. And maybe some will go with her, but I think there's still a lot of like anger and disagreement on that.
And to the point about caucus relations, like, we should not discount the fact that she was a finance minister. And I don't care what anyone tells me, as much as being a finance minister gives you credentials about talking to the economy, it's saying no, exactly, right? No. And that over time just naturally breeds some resentments with people. And
absolutely.
I think some of that may color who decides to endorse who.
Okay. Yeah. Vandana, you've got the third pick in our draft.
Yeah. I'm actually really happy with this one, because I was thinking if I was to go first, I would pick her, because, and for this reason, I would go with Karina Gould, because I think of Delta Guindy back then. I think of Dion. I think never underestimate the one who's underestimated. And I think, again, goes back to media will cover a lot of things. A lot of the shows will cover things. People have a branding, but who can, like, Karina is well liked amongst caucus. People like her. She's kind. She's polite. She talks to people. For people who don't know her, if you see her in the House, and I'll give another story. I was reading Natty Baines and I said, and I was watching Question Period, and I think she was a parliamentary secretary, and Natty Baines' dad called me, and he said, "Who is that? She sounds like a minister." So she's a shark in the House. I've seen her go head to head with Pierre Poilievre. I think if people saw her and saw videos of her, it would help build her branding more. She's also young. She's a millennial, very relatable to a lot of the voters. A lot of the issues that we have, like housing affordability, like she is at the grocery store with her 2 kids, like she's relatable. She also gives another option. If you want to see the first female prime minister, there's another option for you. And if you don't like either Carney or Freeland for whatever reason, you can find something, you can connect with Minister Gould. So I do think if she has a strong organization, I think she can come out as a dark horse or a queenmaker in this.
And I think to that point, like, and I think we're all millennials on this podcast. I think so.
Yes,
Sorry to
I don't
date
know what you're
ourselves.
implying,
Yes.
Tyler. I feel like you looked
I'm
at
not
me
really
and-
sure.
He's looking
I'll
at
just speak for
Dan through the
myself.
lens.
I'm just to speak for myself. But I think one of the challenges for liberals is a generational challenge of how do we reconnect with millennials, and how does the party present a view of how to think about economic policy and social policy in an environment of, as David Coletta would say, scarcity versus abundance, right?
Yeah.
We think about YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, as it relates to housing. And I think we have struggled as a party to position ourselves there in a way that conservatives have, at least at the federal level, done a better job, probably. And if we lose that voter, right, generationally, we could be, I think, damaged quite a bit. And Karina may have an ability to tap into that in a way that will help the party long term.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think as a pollster, if you're asking me, like, what groups do the Liberals need to win back that they can win back? I would say suburban voters, and she's a Burlington MP, so there's a connection there. And I would say millennial women. We did a roll-up of Polera last summer of 10,000 survey data points, and the Conservatives were over 40% among millennial women, which makes no sense. I mean, if you look at a values perspective, if you look at these people from their history, like, there's no reason they should be voting for Pierre Poilievre. But they are, and we need to win them back. And I do think Karina is somebody who, not only just because she is a millennial, I think she actually connects really well with people, because she does not talk like a politician. She talks like a real person. And these days, I think people just want a politician who sounds authentic, who sounds like they mean what they're saying. And I think, that is who she is and how she comes across. She is not just relatable by her demographic. She is relatable because she's a relatable person. So I think that has a lot of appeal to the party. I think for that reason, you're getting excellent value at the number 3 pick here, Vandana. If this was a 6-month draft, I would be tempted to pick Karina ahead of the other 2 people ahead of her, because I think she'd have an opportunity to really do kind of like Jean Charest did in the 93 PC leadership race. I know he didn't beat Kim Campbell, but he was the youngest minister ever. I think she's the youngest woman minister ever. Really make a name for himself and catch fire and really like excite liberals for that reason. I don't know if she'll be able to do that in a short race where she just starts at a huge name recognition disadvantage. When you're 10 meters back in a 100-meter race, it's a lot harder to win that race than if you're 10 meters back in a marathon or a mile race. But I do think she's got a lot going for her. I would also just throw on the table too, I think of all of the Liberal cabinet ministers, I would say she's one of the 2 or 3 best at attacking Pierre Poilievre. When the Liberals have needed to land a attack on Poilievre, they have often put her as the point person on that, because she's not over the top in her criticisms of him. She is very calm and methodical. And again, she comes across as very sincere, and she comes across just talking like a real person talks and criticizing him like a real person would criticize him, not like a politician would criticize him. And if the Liberals are looking for someone to beat Poilievre, and they're going to be looking to see how all of these candidates criticize Poilievre. And I think she's going to come across quite well to that metric. Okay. Let's flip it around. Vandana, you'll get the first pick. We don't need to spend a lot of time on the back end of this draft here, but who would you like to pick for your second pick?
I would go Frank Baylis. And I'll say I worked with him a lot when he was chair of Black Caucus. So I found him, he's a very kind man. I'm not sure if he has of his pickleball ability, but he's a very kind man. He works really hard. I found him very interesting. He drove a lot of initiatives for like Black communities and advocacy, strong history there. So I like him from that perspective. He built it like he's a business person, creating a small business, making it a bigger business. I think that's very relatable to people. And I think he just has interesting ideas. And I think part of this is like, I think some of these candidates who are seen as fringe can still influence bigger candidates based on their ideas. So if he has something, I think, Tyler, you and I were talking about this earlier, he wanted to change the House of Commons in a way that I think some people would be interested in. People were very, disappointed in electoral reform. If he put something forward, even if he's not the one selected, his idea could put pressure on the other candidates who are front runners to adopt them. Or, if he has a small group of people or people just like his idea, people might say, okay, well, Frank Bale's on my team and we'll consider this idea. So I think that gives him something. So Frank Bayless would be my pick.
Yeah, great pickleball player too, I hear.
Where did that come from?
Anything else on Frank Bayless, or should we just move on to the next? Tyler, who do you pick for your second pick?
So I'm going to go into the more rumored category and just say that I think it would be neat to see Andrew Furey into the race, only because he's I think the most successful liberal politician, at least on polling, in the country. He's, led a government that has been around as long as we've been in power, right? They were elected in 2015 with Dwight Ball, gone through that succession. He took over in the middle of COVID, and yet is still at like something like 50% approval rating. That's kind of amazing. And there's something unique there, right? About, I think, obviously unique to Atlantic Canada politics and so forth. So I don't know that he'll get in the race necessarily, although his name is circulated in a few places, but would be an interesting one if he did. He would face, I suspect, the same, be able to speak French challenge as everybody else who on that front. I don't know what his French is like, but he did just do a really significant transformative deal with the province of Quebec on hydro. And if you want to talk about national unity right now, that's important.
The other thing I think that both Frank Bayless and Andrew Furey have going for them is, if you hear this out here, we've got carbon tax Carney, we've got carbon tax Christia, we've got carbon tax Karina, carbon tax Frank, carbon tax Andrew. It really doesn't have that same ring to it. So I think they are more inoculated against conservative attack ads than the other candidates.
They'll find another like spiffy slogan, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure Furey's got it. There's some play on words we could do there that would work too. Okay, for my second pick in the draft to close us out, I'll take Jonathan Wilkinson. I don't know if he's gonna run. I don't think he will, but he is more seriously considering it than a lot of the other names did. There is if you go to this liberal website where you can kind of like put your name to support candidates to run. He actually took a page out there, which Champagne never did. If you go to jonathanwilkinson.ca, it is now password protected. So Politico reported that this morning. So I think at least they are considering it in a serious way, I think, about launching him and putting him into this race. I do think he was in Washington, D.C. this week. I think he's, like Dominic and Melanie, tied up in the Trump stuff, and that may cause him to not want to jump into the race. But look, if he does jump in, he'd be seen as a serious candidate. I don't think Jonathan Wilkinson has ever really made a mistake or slipped up or anything like that in his many years in government, despite having some challenging files. He'd be seen as a very competent, steady leader. With Christy Clark out, there's an opening in British Columbia right now. He's also got some roots in Saskatchewan, which will be helpful in a leadership race. So I think there's a few regional plays that could work to him as well too. So if he does get in, I think he could do all right.
And Dan, it's probably important for us to remind listeners, we didn't get into this into the rules section clearly, but we're going to use a version of weighted one member, one vote, right? And so that gives every riding in the country 100 points potentially. And so a vote, even in a place in, like Kelowna,
Lethbridge,
right? Exactly. Lethbridge, Fort Saskatchewan, whatever, where there are, only a couple hundred members at best, maybe dozens, right? That has huge yield, right? In terms of the impact it'll have across the country compared to the thousands of people who might vote in Toronto Center, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Those things matter. Actually, for a story from the OLP perspective for the Win campaign, I remember Dakar had one delegate in one riding in Northern Ontario and actually became two that was able to win that out. So, they do matter.
Okay. Does anybody want to say anything about Chandra or Hamy or anybody else who we're talking about here?
I will say Jaime. These are the only racialized Frank Bayless, Chandra, and Jaime are the only people from different communities running in leadership. And I will say to anyone, you can put your hands up for that. That is hard to do. So it is. I think for Jaime, it'll be interesting because if he can do it, you can keep reconciliation on the table, which I would worry falls to the side.
Great. Okay. We are fast approaching our end of this leg of the race here. So I know we wanted to talk about kind of big picture questions and things that we're looking for in the leadership race. I'll give a quick round. If there's one thing that you're looking for that you are paying attention to, this race. One question that you are thinking about that we will cover in future episodes. Tyler, what are you thinking about? What are you looking at in this race?
It's really to me a question of how someone's going to differentiate themselves against Trudeau and also against Poilievre, right? Because the things that you decide to take off the field as parts of the Trudeau legacy will impact significantly the strategy that you have going into the next election, right? Depending on whether we want to prosecute a case of cuts against Poilievre, right? If somebody says that they want to potentially downsize the public service, or they want to make significant spending cuts in certain areas, that will have a significant impact on our ability to prosecute a cuts narrative against Poilievre. We've already run ads on that effect, right? So I'm just interested to see like the kind of two-dimensional effects that has between the choices of a legacy versus Poilievre.
Vandana?
So I'm thinking about this a bit selfishly to the organizational perspective, but what issues have affected the government in the last couple of years that's going to affect this leadership race? And I think about it is the communities involved in the conflict in the Middle East, which, I understand we have a ceasefire today, so which is great. But I think, and I don't think any government got it right. But I will say building relationships with those communities involved is going to be key. They're key voter blocks. They've been key in every election I've worked on. So who's going to be able to rebuild those relationships and garner their support? So I'm quite curious about that.
Yeah, and for me in the short term, and this is probably something we will end up talking about next week, is again this issue of tariffs. I'm curious if any of the candidates are going to break from Trudeau when it comes to the approach that he does. Trump's going to come in, maybe he'll do tariffs, the government will react. Will one of these candidates say Justin Trudeau got it wrong? I have a different approach. We already know from reports that Freeland is going to announce dollar for dollar tariff matching. The government may not go there. What do other candidates do? And then especially when we get into the issues around like export taxes on energy and oil, and Daniel Smith is raising a big stink about this at the premier's meeting this week. And as we said, Alberta and Saskatchewan become very important in a leadership race when all of the ridings are weighted equally. We know Carney is going to play himself up as a son of Alberta. Krista Freeland's going to play herself up as a daughter of Alberta. How do they react if we get into a national unity situation around what to do with oil exports during a tariff feud with the U.S.? So I think that could be a very hot policy issue. And I know Tyler likes policy, so that might be something for him and the rest of us to talk about next week. We'll see.
And send us your thoughts. We want to know what questions you want to have answered over the course of these 8 or 9 episodes that we end up doing.
Agreed. All right. So let's stop the clock. This is the segment we will close every show with. Because we are in a race, this is the time to stop the clock for this lap of the race. And each of us can give a bit of a mention to one candidate, to one campaign, to one person, one group who we feel just got it right this week. Or if you want to be a little more mischievous, somebody who really got it wrong too. But who do you think deserves a bit of a recognition for doing a good job and in the leadership race this week? Who wants to kick us off?
I think for me it's easy. It's the Carney Daily Show. I think people have across the board said that was change for them. That saw him in new light. So I think that's the one who nailed it this week.
For me, it's the National Executive Board of the Liberal Party of Canada. And I say thank you to all those people who put in a lot of effort in a short period of time, probably very contentious and stressful and anxious. But also, frankly, because you got to the right result in terms of a date of a leadership race. There was just no world in which we could accept a scenario in which we would not have a leader by March 24th when the House comes back. And that was that would have been prescribed by the Constitution. And I understand the pressure that people would have been under to follow the Constitution to the letter, but that was not what was called for in the moment. And congratulations to all of you for doing the right thing. It would have seemed difficult in the moment, but you got it done.
And those are both great choices that I would agree with as well too. I know it's the first week. I hate to bend the rules the first week. I'm going to give my kind of props here to Mark Carney, Krista Freeland, and Karina Gould, who all seem poised to launch their leadership races, because I know every one of you were told by many, many smart people, do not run in this leadership race. The Liberals are going to lose. They have no chance to win the next election. Save yourself the stress of this. Don't become the shortest serving prime minister ever. Run the next time when the party's on the way up, and take a pass this time. But if everybody does that, we'd be left with either a non serious leader, or we would be left with a leader who wasn't tested in a leadership race, both of which I think are important things. And I think it's great that all three of them are in as serious candidates. And I think they all have a chance to win. And I think it shows they believe in themselves, and it shows they care about the party and ensuring the party has a chance and a fighting chance in the next election campaign. So good job on all three of you. We may criticize you over the next couple of weeks if you mess up, but I'm glad that you are all running in this race. That is our episode for this week. Thanks to our presenting sponsor, TELUS. Also, thanks to Air Quotes Media for getting this podcast launched before any of the leadership campaigns formally launched their campaigns. We beat Mark Carney by a couple of hours, so that is great. Be sure to spread the word and subscribe, and we'll see you next week on the next leg of the race to replace.